Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am so thankful that you are continuing to think through with me the teachings of James. I remind you from what we looked at last time we were together that James is the brother of Jesus. He's now the leader of the church in Jerusalem. If you want to kind of get a glimpse of his leadership, you can look over in Acts chapter 15. And there he is leading the church through a crisis where they're trying to decide as a church what does it mean to be saved and how can a person be saved, specifically whether it's necessary to become a Jew and whether it's necessary to have faith or to have faith and works. It's a large issue, and James is leading the church through this. Last time we were together, we also had the opportunity to be reminded that James is helping us understand that challenges will come. The world in which we live, there are trials, and the challenge that we face is not trying to avoid the trial, but to understand what God is doing in the midst of the trial, that He is trying to grow us up. So the passage we're looking at this morning builds upon it. The passage helps us understand. So what do we do? So James begins in James chapter 1, and I would encourage you to go back and read the first 4 verses to kind of get a running start. But beginning in verse 5, James says this: So if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God. He should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to him. First of all, I just want to remind you, we always need to understand the writings in the context in which they're written. So in order to understand James 1:5, you have to go back and look at what he's saying in the previous chapter, in the previous verses. He said, consider it all joy when you endure various trials. And then he talks about the importance of enduring. The question is, how do you endure? So that's what he addresses in this passage. He says, if any of you lacks wisdom, wisdom is knowledge and application. It is an understanding that this is what is right and this is how it impacts the way I live. For example, we know that we are to be people of integrity. That can be knowledge, but it becomes wisdom when we put it into practice and we make certain that in our businesses we are people of integrity, in our relationship with our spouses and our families that we are people of integrity. So here, what he says is, if you are lacking wisdom, if you're struggling with how to make it through difficult trials, how do I stay under the load? How can I keep living for Christ? How can I consider it pure joy? Here's what he says: ask. Just ask God. It's interesting that oftentimes in our lives, when we find ourselves needing help, we go to every person, including ourselves, and we try to seek help and guidance. And here's what God says: just ask me. You probably have experienced this as a pastor, or better yet, as a parent before. A child will come to you and your child will say something about a crisis that they're walking through, and they'll say something like, I just didn't know what to do. And you say to them, why didn't you ask? I could have helped you. It's exactly what God is saying. God says to us through James, when you're walking through difficult trials, when difficulties come your way, when you don't know whether you have the strength to stay under the load, you don't know what to do next, just ask. Just ask God. I do want to remind you that this is a very poignant reminder to each one of us that God should be the default. He is the person we go to first. He's the one that we ask. And so he says, if you lack wisdom, ask God. Now he describes God a little bit differently here so that we understand. He says, first of all, he's a God who gives. It's interesting. We don't have to beg God for wisdom. He gives us wisdom. Now, he wants to make sure we're listening, and you can ask for wisdom. If you don't put it into practice, then you can't expect him to keep giving you wisdom. But if you ask him and you sincerely desire God's wisdom, God, I want to know how I can live for you in this situation. I want to be able to consider it joy, even though it's very difficult at this point. If you make that your prayer, then you can come to God with the certainty that He is a God who gives. As a matter of fact, one of the ways you can understand who God is just to understand that He is a gracious God who consistently gives. He gives us grace, He gives us forgiveness, He gives us restoration. By the way, He gives us His Son who died upon the cross. He is a God who gives. Notice it says He gives to all generously. It is a reminder that He is one who gives freely, but He also gives what we need. He's not going to give us just enough, and He's not going to give us a little bit, and He's not going to say, I'm sorry, I've already answered that question 3 times for you, and stop. He's going to give to us generously with great grace, and He's going to do so ungrudgingly. I'm not real sure this is the best translation of the word. In the King James Version, the word that's translated ungrudgingly here in the CSB is the word upbraideth not. That probably doesn't have a lot of meaning to us. Here's what he says. If you come to God and you ask for wisdom, He's going to give you all the wisdom you need. He's generous. And He's going to do so in an ungrudging manner. He's not going to reproach you. What that literally means is this. He's not going to get onto you for asking for wisdom. And He's not going to get onto you for asking for wisdom for the same situation a second and third time where you keep saying, God help me, God help me, God help me. He doesn't say, I've had enough, stop. He never does that. But instead, He gives to us ungrudgingly. So the promise is, if you lack wisdom, ask. And you ask God, He gives to us generously and ungrudgingly. And the promise is, it'll be given to the one who asks. Just a reminder that so often we try to live life on our own, and God never intended for us to live life on our own. He never intended for us to live life of our own wisdom. And when we do, we find ourselves failing. We find ourselves falling short of what God desires. And so He says, just ask. But look at what verse 6 says. When the person asks, let him ask in faith. Our whole relationship with Christ and with God is built on faith. It's based on faith. Of course, it's based on the work of God, and we are saved by faith in God's work. Faith means to trust, to believe. So when we ask of God, we trust Him. We trust that He's going to answer us, and so it makes us listen carefully. We trust that when He does answer, it's the right answer. We trust as well that He is going to be looking out for our good, for what is best for us. Even when we can't understand it, we trust Him. Trust is difficult sometimes. And we need to admit that sometimes we struggle to believe. I'm always reminded of the man that's described in the New Testament when Jesus said, do you believe? And he said, I do believe. Help me when I don't believe. We all are in those points where we struggle on occasions with believing. And that's what the word faith means. But this time James is saying when we ask, we need to ask believing in who God is, believing He's going to answer, and believing that His answer is right. So let him ask in faith and don't doubt. The word that's used there for doubt is a compound verb in Greek, and it literally means to judge through it. It's where you ask, God answers, and if you're not careful, doubting is when you start thinking, is that really true? Well, if I do that, what happens? What about this? And you start judging it. What he says is that's not faith. Faith is when you ask, and God answers, and that's it. So he says, don't doubt. Trust. When we begin our walk with Christ, we are called to do so by faith, by trusting Him. We're to have faith like Abraham. As a matter of fact, read Hebrews 11. You'll see the hall of faith where person after person is described as being a person of faith, and God used that faith to change things. And he says that's who we are to be. And I want to encourage us each one of us, to pray for one another, that we would be people who have faith, that we believe. By the way, if you really believe something, it changes what you do. That's what he's getting to this point. If you really believe and you trust God and he answers, then you're going to obey. You're not going to say, well, that doesn't make sense. In my own life, Jan and I prayed. We prayed that God would lead us, and God led us to New Orleans. And there have been throughout history, not a lot, but some people who said, are you sure you want to live in New Orleans? Are you sure you want to raise a family in New Orleans? What we know is that God called us here. And therefore, the thing we are called to do is to believe. And so we refuse to doubt that we should be here. We know we are to be here because that's what God said. That's what he said. Live by faith. All of our lives we live by faith. And then he goes on and describes it this way. He says, look, the one who doubts is like the surging sea, driven and tossed by the wind. It's interesting, the image that he uses in verse 6 is the image of the impact of that which is outside. It's like if you start doubting, you start getting pushed around. Here's what happens. God says, here's what I want you to do. You've been asking me for wisdom. Here's wisdom. Here's what I need you to do, and here's how you should respond. And then suddenly we hear people saying, you shouldn't do that, and we find ourselves blown in one direction. And then somebody else says, yeah, here's the way I would do it. I don't think I could do that. I don't know why you'd want to do that. And you're going back and forth, and you find yourself just being blown back and forth, blown about by the opinions and the thoughts of others, by the way, including our own personal opinions. He says that's not faith. When you ask in faith, you do so without doubting, because the doubter's just blown everywhere. And then he says, you know what? If you doubt, the person who doubts, he shouldn't expect to receive anything from the Lord. If you want to receive God's blessings, if you want to receive his wisdom, if you want to receive what is God's best for your life, you come to him and you ask for wisdom. And when he gives you wisdom, when he gives you knowledge and direction and instruction, then you do it. If you don't, then you're going to miss out on what God desires. You're going to miss out on that maturity. You're going to miss out on those opportunities. You're going to miss out on the opportunity to grow. And he says, you know what? You're a double-minded person. The word that's used there for double-minded, if you're not one who has complete faith, by the way, I struggle to understand incomplete faith or partial faith. There's really not anything like that. Faith is all in. So if you're not trusting in God completely, you're double-minded. The word literally says you're double-souled. S-O-U-L-E-D. That means that you have part of your soul is here and part of your soul is here. You're trusting this, you're trusting that. And then he says this, you are unstable. You are not firm in anything. All of life is shifting sand. As a matter of fact, Jesus tells the parable of the man who built his house upon the sand. We know the song as a child. Here's what he tells us. If you're not trusting in God, you're not being obedient to him, then you have no foundation. And not just part of your life is going to be unstable, but all of your life. This is a call for us. If things are not going as we think they should, it forces us to ask, so what in the world is going on? And sometimes we discover that we're just not trusting in God like we're supposed to. And he says this, so if you lack wisdom, ask God, but trust God. Now in verses 9 and through 12, he especially addresses who should trust in God. And here's what he says. It doesn't matter whether you have nothing or a whole lot. We need to trust in God. So he says this, let the brother of humble, let the lowly person. And by the way, he's not necessarily talking about poor. He's talking about a person that doesn't have a lot of access to money and power and authority, kind of your everyday guy. He says, let this person, let him boast, let him find great joy in his exaltation. Here's what James says. Don't worry about the fact that you're considered low or humble by the world. You're a child of God. You're exalted. And then he says the opposite. Let the rich person boast, by the way, not in how much stuff he has, but instead let him boast that there was a humbling moment in which he became a servant of God, because it is being a child of God and being a servant of God that's going to matter. In the day in which James is writing, many people saw that riches were a sign of blessings. And here's what James says: wealth is not a sign of blessing. That doesn't mean that God doesn't provide wealth. I know some individuals who have a great deal of wealth, and God's given it to them because they are wise and good stewards, and they're very generous. So there's nothing wrong with wealth. It's wrong when wealth becomes God of our lives, when it becomes important, and when we start trusting in our wealth. And here's what he says: don't trust in your wealth. Remember that time when you humbled yourself and you became like Christ? That's what you should find real joy in. And here's the reason why. The things that are around here will pass away. It's going to pass away like a flower of the field. For the sun rises, and together with it comes the scorching wind. It dries up the grass, its flower falls off, its beautiful appearance perishes. In the same way, the rich person will wither away while pursuing his activities. He's not saying that a person who has money or whatever is going to pass away, but he is saying this: it doesn't matter whether you have money or not. If you're trusting in something other than Jesus Christ, and if your greatest joy, the thing that you boast about, the thing that brings you great satisfaction, if that is not God and being a child of God, then you're going to build your life upon things that will disappear. We see this all the time in the world in which we live. People are living for today. They're living for reputations and money. And, the joke is, but it's so true, none of that stuff is stuff you're going to be able to take with you. It's going to all disappear. It's going to be gone instantly. And so he says, invest in that which is important. So he leaves us then with this final statement, which is reminiscent of Jesus' statements in the Beatitudes. The word blessed means favor. This is the person that God looks toward. This is the person that God says, this is a favored child. Blessed is the one who endures, who stays under the load. That should be our goal, not to avoid the trials, not to run from the trials, but to stay under and to be the person God's called us to be as he's strengthening us. Because he says this: you understand that you are blessed when you endure the trial, because when, by the way, it's interesting, not if you're going to God for wisdom and difficulties and trials come your way, the promise is you're going to stand. So when you've stood the test, you will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. I love this phrase, crown of life. Literally, it says you're going to receive the crown, which is life. You know what he says? Life here upon this earth is grand and great, and there are many parts that we all love. I love life. I embrace life. But someday we're going to get to heaven and we're going to say, wow, that was good, but this is life. And that's the crown. That's what we're living for. So as we endure upon this earth, we do so with the understanding that today is today, and today will pass away. But one day we're going to be in the very presence of Jesus, and it will never pass away. We will be his for eternity. We will experience what it means to have abundant life. By the way, we get a taste of it now. But there's a day coming in which we will get the crown, which is abundant life, where we receive back what God desires to give us for the life that we've lived. So I encourage you today, living for Christ. It's the life Christ has called us to live. If you struggle with how to do so, ask God, and then keep living for him no matter how difficult it gets, no matter whether cancer comes or financial troubles or the economy tanks, no matter what happens, you keep living for God. Endure with the promise that one day the crown, which is life, abundant and eternal life, will be given to you. May God bless you. I look forward to us continuing to study together.